history rarely offers true resets. Instead, systems tend to fail slowly, collapsing under the weight of fundamental contradictions until a catalyst forces violent change. This is the pattern of power. A stable order, built on injustice, eventually becomes unsustainable. The story of Zimbabwe is a stark examination of this process, detailing how a post-colonial economy, stable for 2 decades, was dismantled in less than 10 years by the very issue it failed to resolve at independence: the land. When Zimbabwe emerged from the Rhodesian Bush War in 1980, the existing order was clear and deeply fractured. Approximately 4,500 white commercial farmers controlled 51% of the total arable land. Crucially, this was not simply half the acreage. It was the overwhelming majority of the nation's Grade A agricultural land, benefiting from the best rainfall, infrastructure, and legal protections. This structural inequality, inherited from colonial rule, was the engine of the economy. Commercial agriculture accounted for up to 40% of the nation's GDP and was the primary generator of foreign currency. Stability was maintained through this productive efficiency, but it rested on a hidden weakness. Millions of indigenous Zimbabweans remained marginalized on less fertile lands, nurturing a political and economic time bomb that required only the right spark to ignite. For 2 decades, the structural pressure mounted. The initial policy, voluntary land redistribution, proved too slow and too expensive to address the historical imbalance. By 1990, only about 20% of white-owned land had been transferred. As the cost of acquiring land soared, the government's commitment flagged, driven by misaligned incentives and institutional inertia. The vast majority of the wealthy elite benefited from the status quo, while the promise of true reform became a source of increasing political strain. By the late 1990s, the economic strains became acute, and President Robert Mugabe, the longtime central actor in the nation's politics, faced a shifting constraint set. His political dominance was waning, coinciding with external pressures and rising domestic dissent. To retain power, the government pivoted away from economic prudence and toward political mobilization. The immense, unresolved land question offered a powerful nationalist narrative. It was a tool waiting to be leveraged. The government, rather than the colonial powers, was now perceived as failing to deliver justice. This pressure required a high-impact, visible solution, regardless of the economic cost.
The catalyst event arrived not as an economic shock, but as a political humiliation. In February 2000, a government-backed constitutional referendum, which included provisions for land acquisition, was decisively rejected by the electorate. This was not merely a defeat, it was a demonstration of fundamental political weakness for Mugabe and the ruling ZANU-PF. The response was immediate and strategic: the launch of the Fast-Track Land Reform Program. This was the moment the system transitioned from decay to violent action. Land seizures, often backed by military and organized militants, began across the country. Decisions were driven by political survival, not agricultural planning. The central actor, the state apparatus, ascended through exploiting disorder. The system adapted instantly to bypass legal and economic constraints. Compensation was abandoned, expertise was ignored. Thousands of highly productive farms were rapidly redistributed, predominantly to political elites, military officials, and party loyalists, who lacked the necessary capital and knowledge to maintain commercial operations. This was a tactical move to secure power, but its consequence was the immediate strategic dismantling of the nation's economic base.
The consequence of the FTLRP was swift and brutal.
The collapse of commercial agriculture removed up to 40% of Zimbabwe's GDP and its primary source of export earnings. Foreign currency dried up. The state, facing mounting debt and revenue collapse, responded with the only tool it retained, the Reserve Bank's printing press. This led to the critical confrontation with fundamental economic reality, hyperinflation. The state attempted to monetize its political failure. It was not sanctions that triggered the collapse, though targeted restrictions worsened isolation. It was the catastrophic destruction of the productive sector, financed by unrestrained money creation. In November 2008, the system broke entirely. The monthly inflation rate hit an estimated 79.6 billion%. Prices were doubling approximately every 24 hours. The spectacle of economic failure was symbolized by the introduction of the $100 trillion note. The currency had ceased to function as a store of value or a medium of exchange. The conflict was resolved not by political action, but by the market's simple, final rejection of the currency. In April 2009, the Zimbabwean dollar was officially abandoned, and the nation adopted the US dollar and other foreign currencies.
The resolution of the immediate crisis was stabilization through dollarization, but the deeper conflict, debt and isolation, remained. Following Robert Mugabe's removal in 2017, the new government, led by Emmerson Mnangagwa, prioritized re-engagement with international creditors, seeking to restructure a $21 billion external public debt and lift restrictive sanctions like ZEDERA. This led to the defining post-collapse negotiation, the Global Compensation Deed, signed in July 2020. The government agreed to pay $3.5 billion to the former white farmers, but only for the infrastructure and improvements, explicitly avoiding compensation for the land itself, a liability estimated between $30 and $40 billion. This strategic partial payment was designed to signal good faith to the African Development Bank and Western nations. Yet, this resolution contains a functional contradiction. The payment terms, mostly low-liquidity treasury bonds, are viewed as non-viable by former farmers. More critically, the government has moved to cement the FTLRP outcome by proposing to grant full title deeds to current indigenous landholders, while restricting returning white farmers to non-collateralizable leases. The goal of attracting capital and agricultural expertise is undermined by the inability of investors to use land as collateral for bank loans. Zimbabwe secured a diplomatic victory, but not an economic one. The pattern introduced at the start persists. Political constraints ultimately shape economic decisions. The attempt to repair the nation's finances without sacrificing political control over the land ensures that the fundamental uncertainties of debt resolution and agricultural revival remain unresolved.